Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of this Boldy, James, and Sterling Toles album, Manger on McNichols. This is a new full-length LP from Detroit rapper Boldy James, who's teamed up with producer Sterling Toles. Now, if you didn't already know, Boldy's been making a lot of prolific moves in 2020, first kicking off the year back in February with the Alchemist-produced Price of Tea in China. This past August, he teamed up with Griselda Records to release the short and sweet Versace tape, and he's actually planning on dropping one more before the clock runs out on 2020 with producer Real Bad Man, Real Bad Boldy. That's not out at the time that I am shooting this video, but it may be at the time you're watching this, so check it out. I guess we'll see how that one pans out. But in this video, I want to roll back on something that Boldy released this past summer, Manger on McNichols, which has gone down this year as one of the more unique hip-hop records I've heard. First impression, I wasn't necessarily blown away by it, but there are some characteristics about it that have stuck with me for the rest of the year, so I figured that alone makes it worth talking about. First, let's address Boldy on this thing. Going back to his debut in 2013, he's been known for his coke-covered rhymes, his Detroit drawl, and slow flows. Not exactly the most gripping delivery I've ever heard in my life, but his lyrical focus and knack for detail makes him a formidable storyteller. And Manger on McNichols is a storyteller's album, not just going over the drug game in a passive or a flashy way, but diving into the toll it's taken on Boldy, his friends, his family, his larger community. There's a strong element of tragedy to much of what Boldy says on this project, and that is greatly amplified by the jazzy, experimental, and cinematic production laid throughout this thing by Sterling Toles, who I understand has been working on this project for years, and I mean years. The initial verses for this project are reported to have been recorded back in 2007. Then, for over a decade, Sterling Toles assembled the musicians, instrumental bits, and drum parts that would make up the rest of the project, after which Boldy would come back and re-record additional stuff for this thing to just make it come to completion. Yeah, listening to it, a lot of the material here sounds like the result of a very long-term effort. The kind of lyrical and instrumental detail found on this record you don't just drum up in a matter of minutes. From the intro track, MEDUSA, which opens up with a very sad and weary violin and audio of a woman telling a story about how jobs in her community essentially washed out, leaving people impoverished, which quickly transitions into these dreamy, delayed verses from Boldy that top some lumbering beats, smooth fretless bass, and vibraphone. It's quite a sound palette, especially for a hip-hop album of this style, where Boldy is calling himself a con creature as a result of the work he's doing out there on the streets. Pay attention to terminology like this too, because it does come up again and again throughout the rest of the record. And look, this is just one section of the track. Following this portion, we have a phone call skit that interrupts things, kind of gives more to the storyline, some speedy acoustic arpeggios, cinematic backup vocals that just color the background beautifully, more violin. Like, what? The instrumental ambition on this project right from the get-go is incredible, and the places that Boldy goes lyrically are devastating. Baby on the Way, trying to find a job and transition out of dealing, having been convicted of a felony but saying no on the job application anyway. The song closes out with some very grim lines too. I still got the work and I'm selling whole things, got pills for dessert, heroin for dope fiends who flick, burn, and set it on flame, and then insert it in their varicose veins. So yeah, this is not a feel-good album, and if for you personally this is just too much, you might as well turn back now. The following Welcome to 76 has a bit more bump in the instrumentals, some wonderful pianos and strings, as well as woodwind passages coalescing gorgeously. There are numerous instrumental transitions and embellishments throughout the track, but I love that no matter how much is going on, Boldy never really sounds lost in any of it, which I attribute greatly to his authoritative voice and Sterling Toles just doing a hell of a job of arranging around these verses in a way that is tasteful and complimentary. Then the bone-chilling lyrical insinuation of the track is that the children of Detroit, or Boldy's community, will fall into this same cycle of drugs and violence that he has. Despite their potential as individuals, and despite despite their innocence, you still have being described on the track drugs infiltrating the school. You have vocals from First Lady Deja on the track as well, who sounds essentially like a much younger voice on the song to play off of Boldy's voice, who comes off like a veteran at this point. It's just like this horrid torch is being passed down generationally via this rap duet. Detroit River Rock sees Boldy riding these explorative layers of jazz fusion, trumpet, and bass, which eventually blossom into these fast, incredible, and indescribable trade-offs between drums and various vocal samples and instrumental embellishments. There's a beautiful chaos to what Sterling Toles is doing here, but I love that throughout it, Boldy sounds really steady vocally. It's like he's anchoring the whole thing down. In a way, he's like a monk exerting this stillness into a world of disorder. And this is a bit of a vibe I get off many subsequent tracks on this project too, BB Butcher being one of them, where Boldy calmly rides these busy drums, tight organs and bass lines with a super monotone flow. The first leg of the track does drag a little bit, but as soon as he drops this ruthless bar about nothing being worse than when you have to sell dope, there's just this incredible pickup on the rhythms, these vocal trade-offs, and some gospel-inspired vocals hanging in the background, building higher and higher and higher until the end of the track reaches this very noisy climax that is packed with so many overwhelming sound effects I can't even separate all of them, which creates incredible cover for a seamless transition into the next track, The Middle of Next Month, which is not one of my favorites here. I think instrumentally maybe there's just too much chaos going on this one. Boldy does sound a tad bit buried, plus I can't say many of the trumpet, synth, and guitar embellishments through the cut sound all that harmonious or with the rhythm section of the instrumental, which I'm sure to a degree is intentional, but I'm not really crazy about the final result. Still, I do love the depressive heaviness that the song brings overall. It does continue the dour vibe that the tracks up until this point have. The Safe is a little interlude of sorts, a short story that works as a palate cleanser, lightens the mood maybe a little bit before we move into one of the darkest numbers here, Dearest, which features these absolutely mournful layers of saxophone, bass, vibraphone, woodwinds. Over this soundtrack, Boldy goes over his very thoughtful but complicated feelings about his mother, the separation between her and his father. From what he's saying on this track, it sounds like this whole ordeal really left a hole in his heart and made other relationships in his family, even with his sister, more difficult. I mean, everything about this track actually sounds difficult. Even Boldy talking about the song in a clipped interview at the very end, he sounds absolutely depressed. Considering the potency of emotions on this track, I can absolutely understand why. But I do have to commend the fact that he and Sterling Toles have done such a great job of making those emotions translate so well just in music. Following this, we have Birth of Bold, which is a bit of an origin story of sorts with a few sensual bars here and there. Instrumentally, it comes off like a somewhat lazy and cluttered piece of G-funk playing in slow motion. It does run a little awkward in my opinion, not the smoothest of cuts here or most instrumentally ambitious either, but I guess I do like that it's a bit of an emotional switch. Then Requiem is one of the shorter and dreamier bits on the record. That's pretty narratively intensive. Boldy tells this story of an orphaned boy who falls into a cycle of drugs and violence, not really having that supportive family structure to help him through life. His life intersects with Boldy's at some point, which allows him to tell his story secondhand, and certainly the reality of what's going on here is very, very heavy. But given the lack of instrumental ambition as well as song structure, it just doesn't stand out as one of the stronger moments here. And the final Got Flicked, the Rebirth, is an 8-minute monster. Kicks off with a lengthy verse from Louis P. Newton as well as a lot of improvisational synths. When Boldy comes in, the bass and drums really pick up, and what transpires past this point is some of the most sprawling jazz rap I've ever heard in my life. Now, I will say though, the mix on this track is a little muddy. It's not as clean as many of the other others are on this project. I'm not exactly sure why. I still think much of the beauty of this piece does translate, and it does make for a pretty grand finale for it all. With all that being said though, I think this project is pretty great. Definitely one of the more solid and impressive hip-hop projects of 2020, especially on the storytelling side and especially on the instrumental side. And while, as I said earlier, it does sound like a lot of time went into this over a very long course of time, simultaneously though, I think working on this project in a way where we're coming back to it after these long periods of time has kind of impacted the flow of the entire thing and has made it so that there aren't super close connections thematically amongst a lot of these pieces. The flow of the entire thing comes off a little awkward, with each song feeling almost like an island. Plus, I don't think the entire thing ties up at the finish lyrically as well as it does instrumentally. Still, I'm feeling a light 8 on this one. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Boldy James, forever.